This is me. My name is Michael Thomas Chiango. I am 18 years old. I went to Catholic grade school and Catholic high school. Nearly everyone in my family and my friends are Christians. I was raised by a Catholic mother and a non-denominational Christian father to believe in my Lord and Savior Jesus Christ with all my heart and soul. And I am an atheist. Let's talk about that, shall we? This 3-part video series will be going over my own personal journey that I took from believing Catholic Christian to unapologetic atheist. Let's get to it then, shall we? Yes, we atheists all have our own unique story to tell about how we got to that point, and I have certainly watched many of them during my time in the atheistic depths of the internet. So when it comes to a person's personal departure from religion, there are usually some pretty common themes tying all the stories together, but each story is unique in its own way. And I guess I just want to share mine with whoever is listening as some kind of catharsis for myself. But I also think that it is valuable to understand the experiences of others by hearing their stories, even if you don't actually know them that well or at all. So I would like to think this 3-part video has some kind of value amidst the many other videos of its kind. This will also be a bit of an explanation to many of the Christians who are in my life and don't entirely understand why I have seemingly gone through such a drastic change over the past year, and have completely rejected over a decade of doctrine that has been pushed upon me. I will be sharing my experiences and explaining exactly how I was able to come to the conclusion that I did, because a lot of the time it is more effective to try to get someone to understand your point of view by sharing your own personal life experiences with them, rather than just relying on rational arguments. But anyway, let's get to the actual story. Let's get it underway. So as I said before, I am the son of a Catholic mother and a non-denominational Christian father. I also have a family on both sides that is composed of almost exclusively Christians. And, I went to Catholic high school and Catholic grade school. I learned the doctrine of Christianity for 14 whole years of my life. So with all that constant exposure to Christianity in my upbringing, I bet you're wondering, how could I have possibly ended up as an atheist after all is said and done? Well, it was certainly a gradual process. I didn't just wake up one day and proclaim, I don't believe in God now. When I was a little kid, I was actually completely positive that God absolutely did exist and that Jesus Christ was my Lord and Savior. Because after all, if every single person in my life was telling me that that's true, then, it must be true. However, while my faith was strong as a kid, a biblical scholar I was not, and I honestly couldn't have cared less about anything that I was learning in religion class, and I could scarcely even pay attention to the words of the priest at Mass. Studying the Bible was just so boring to me, and while I knew it was important, I just couldn't get into it. However, there was one thing that I had an incredible amount of passion for, and that was science.
The magical science!
I loved science when I was a little kid. I still have an interest in science today, but when I was a little kid, I was borderline obsessed with it. I loved studying chemistry, biology, ecology, anatomy, and especially space science, and at the time when I was a little kid, my dream when I grew up was one day to become a theoretical physicist, only to later realize in high school that physics is actually the science area that I completely suck at. To be honest, I was really just a little Sheldon Cooper wannabe when I was a little kid, which is quite foreshadowy, actually, since Sheldon Cooper is an atheist on the Big Bang Theory. Regardless, though, I absolutely adored science, and I took every chance I had to read science books or watch science documentaries when they came on TV. And I'm actually kind of proud of little kid me, because by the time I was only 8 years old, I really already had a much greater knowledge of space science and other scientific subjects than most full-grown adults that I talk to today. Yeah. While other kids were doing lame stuff like riding bikes, I was at home trying to binge Morgan Freeman's Through the Wormhole. And also riding bikes, because, how else am I going to accidentally slam my face into the concrete? Back to the point, though, the reason why I loved, and still love, science so much was because it was able to explain to me so much of why the world was the way it was. Its explanatory power was really what drew me to it, because I had a deep desire to want to understand the natural world. Granted, while I was taking in the information, I wasn't always able to process everything and piece things together, and I didn't always come away with a deep understanding of what I was learning about. I also had a particularly annoying habit at the time of talking out of my ass to people whenever I didn't know something. But seriously though, the reason why science appealed to me so much more than religion did was because with science I truly felt like I was able to gain a better understanding of the world, and what I was learning about mattered, where with religion, I never really felt like I was learning anything that important. I mean, in class we mostly went over stories from the Bible, like, the vast majority of which didn't have anything to do with actual history. Like in theology class, we were learning about things like the reason why there were 12 tribes of Israel, a nomadic desert culture with like 3 million people at best. I mean, I was no big fan of history at the time, but at least in that class, it felt like we were learning about actual events in history that, made a noticeable impact on the world. And also, for some reason, they tended to feel a little bit more realistic than the book with talking snakes and donkeys. But on top of that, though, there were many things in the Bible that I was taught that just didn't really seem to make that much sense to me, and I was even learning about things that directly contradicted what I was learning about in the field of science. And, naturally, being Mr. Science Man Boy thing, so naturally being Mr. Science at the time, I was not about to take that lying down. So when I was, I believe, 8 years old, and during my religion class, the teacher was lecturing about Adam and Eve, the creation story, the stuff in Genesis 1 to 3, I decided to ask her something along the lines of, teacher, that doesn't quite make sense. You're saying the universe is several thousand years old, but it's actually 13.7 billion years old. Also, the entire universe was definitely not created in 6 days because over time from its initial expansion from a singularity, it slowly cooled, forming stars from the hydrogen gas clouds, and eventually planets formed around those stars, and the Earth was formed approximately 4.5 billion years ago, and life evolved very gradually with modern humans only coming into the picture about 200,000 years ago. Also, how did Adam and Eve have so many descendants that they grew to such a massive population that we see today in only a few thousand years, if there were so many dangerous things on the earth that would have been able to kill them? Also, wouldn't their sons and daughters have had to, marry each other? I mean, that's really weird, Teach. Yeah, I was that kid during school. The one who constantly blurts out a bunch of facts and asks a bunch of questions all the time. So, anyway, of course, since I was completely sure that God existed and that all the adults telling me that he did exist couldn't possibly be wrong, I was sure that my religion teacher would give me a satisfying answer that would explain all my doubts away. However, what her actual response to my question was, well, Michael, not everything in the Bible is supposed to be taken completely literally. And to be honest, this was simultaneously the best and worst answer that she could have given. What I mean by this is the fact that, in the short term, I was completely satisfied with that answer, as she seemingly rectified the fact that the scientific facts that I was learning didn't line up with what I was learning in the Bible, because, now anything that didn't make sense in the Bible could simply be written off as metaphorical for something. But over time, as I thought about it more, this argument really started to fall to pieces for me. Because, if some things are the Bible are metaphors and some things are truth, then how are you actually supposed to tell what is the truth in what is often referred to by Christians as the ultimate book of truth? I thought to myself, obviously all the important stuff, like the stuff with Jesus, is pure truth and not just a metaphor. But wait, the explanation for the creation of the universe given in the Bible, that seems kind of important. Why wouldn't God just say what actually happened? Why make up this ridiculous story with a talking snake that the Bible never specifies is actually a metaphor? And on top of that, if some stories are supposed to be metaphorical, then what are stories like the obviously fictional Noah's Ark stories supposed to be a metaphor for? That God likes to drown people? It was a gradual process of questioning, but things were starting to make less and less sense to me about the Bible, and I just felt myself doubting the Word of God more and more over time, to the point where, when I was going through my freshman year of high school, my doubts weren't just, healthy doubts, otherwise known as questioning, which my teachers said were totally fine so long as they led me back to belief in God, but instead actual doubts, in that I wasn't totally sure that God existed anymore. I believed in God less and less with each successive year, and I had also gotten no better at actually studying the Word of God. It was still really boring and uninteresting to me. My brain had also basically created an automatic signal, which activated whenever I went to Mass, causing me to not be able to pay attention to anything at all. There were entire Masses where I was so disinterested that I just thought about the Hulk from Avengers fighting the Lizard from Spider-Man for an entire hour. At the time, I felt incredibly guilty. I hated myself for not even being interested enough in my Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ, to pay attention in Mass, and I especially hated the doubts that I was having about God's existence, and I wanted them to go away because, as is common for people growing up in a Christian environment, Since I was a Christian, I was told that people who don't believe in Jesus are punished eternally in the fires of hell. Of course, when I was younger and believed much more strongly, I did not have a fear of hell, because I obviously believed in God and Jesus, and I thought that I was following his works, so clearly I was going to heaven, unlike all those other non-Christians who were totally going to burn in hell forever. And honestly, saying that out loud, in a long history of acting like a stupid little kid and believing so many ridiculous things when I was younger, that is definitely the thing I am most ashamed of my younger self. I still can't believe that I actually thought other people were going to be tortured forever just for disbelief, and that I was actually okay with that. However, as an emerging teenager though, what with the fact that I was really starting to doubt in God's existence, there was now a real legitimate chance that I might actually be the one to go to hell for my disbelief, and that terrified me. However, it wasn't just my doubts and my lax attitude towards math and theology class that was giving me anxiety. You see, all this anxiety was building up around the time I was going through puberty, and as is common for boys going through puberty, I had begun masturbating. Now, I had no idea that that's what I was even doing, because I basically got no legitimate sex education other than man and woman make baby together, until I had already gone through puberty, and even after puberty, my sex education was still severely lacking. However, I still did know from my Catholic education that sex was only supposed to be expressed between a man and a woman in marriage, and I deduced from that what I was doing, a form of sexual pleasuring to myself, was obviously wrong and a sin, rather than, a perfectly normal and healthy bodily function that nearly everyone with the sex drive engages in. I found that no matter how hard I tried, I simply could not resist the temptation to masturbate. And that really got me worried for myself. I thought that I was going to get prostate cancer. I thought I had an addiction. Of course, at the time I was completely unaware of what the actual definition of an addiction was. But yeah, like I said, I didn't know what the hell I was doing. I didn't learn about any of this stuff. And when I eventually did learn about it in high school, it was only about how wrong and contrary to God's plan for sexuality it was. So yeah, at the time I was feeling some pretty genuine guilt, and I most definitely wanted to avoid burning in hell for eternity. That's eternity, and you can't escape from that. Granted, let me make one thing clear. While I was certainly concerned and even afraid at times of the eternal damnation of hell, I would definitely say that it was not the main source of anxiety for me. See, hell as a concept, eternal damnation, was a pretty terrible fate, and it definitely left me with an existential sense of dread. But it was still maybe 70 years or so down the line, and I wasn't really thinking about it every single day. I think that's why, even though Christianity uses carrot and stick motivational tactics to the extreme, the afterlife is still too much of a nebulous and far-out concept to cause children to conform well to certain behaviors, and why there are so many believing Christians who still do choose to break the rules. Regardless, while I was still very scared of the make-believe concept of hell, my very real and very unhealthy anger and emotional issues as a child were really the main source of dysfunction for me. I was a really messed up kid, and I can tell you, believing in God certainly never offered me any help in getting better. Continuing though, when I eventually did get to my freshman year in high school, bringing with me my damaged faith, lo and behold, the very first assignment that year in theology class was to write an essay for the teacher about the current state of my faith. And I didn't really know what I should do. I was thinking to myself, should I just lie and say that my faith is great? That's probably what she wants. And I really wasn't in the mood for getting a bad grade, since in high school I was just entering the period in my life where I became, super obsessed with my grades in school and was compulsed to get perfect grades for each class. In the end, though, after thinking about it, I just decided that I should be as intellectually honest as possible and write exactly what I was feeling about my faith in my essay. So I did, and it was a very, very painful process, which involved a lot of crying, and it actually is totally not for the reason you're thinking. It was just that it wasn't that it was too painful for me to write about these specific feelings. It was just really because at the time I really sucked at writing essays, and like I said, I had some pretty serious emotional control issues and couldn't deal with frustration easily. But yeah, I managed to finish my essay, and I got a really good grade from my teacher, which, I certainly enjoyed. All seemed well, and she didn't really seem to be offended or anything when I talked in the paper about not really being sure about this whole faith thing. But when she talked about my paper with me, she said something that I was not expecting. She said to me, "I really liked your essay, Michael, but I was really surprised by it. All the other kids were talking about how their faith was so strong and how they were so sure of God's existence." This really caught me off guard at the time, because even though I was embarrassed for myself, I had just kind of assumed that a lot of people my age were having those doubts that I was. I mean, how could they not be having those doubts, right? With a concept that just didn't really seem to make that much sense and didn't have any solid proof for it. I mean, I definitely already knew that some kids in school had been known to cheat and be intellectually dishonest in their work. Not me, though, because throughout all 4 years of high school, I never managed to cheat a single time. Hashtag humblebrag. So I thought, maybe some kids were just, lying about their faith. I mean, I originally considered lying about it. Either way, the experience certainly stuck out to me. I think it was the first moment where it really hit me where I was like, maybe I might think a little differently than other kids do. Moving on, though, throughout high school, I will definitely say that I found it much easier to pay attention in theology class than I did in grade school religion. That was partly because, as I said before, I was going through a period in my life where I was obsessed over my grades, and getting good grades requires that you learn stuff. But my newfound focusing skills were also partly due to the fact that I actually found the subjects we were learning about in high school theology class more interesting, since we weren't simply studying and trying to memorize history and Bible verses exclusively, but instead the courses were actually more going into depth about what the Catholic faith actually taught, and we had more free-form discussions in class that were at least kind of interesting to me. Don't get me wrong, I mean, I still couldn't pay attention in Mass to save my life, because, seriously, Catholic Mass is like the most boring thing on the planet, but I was paying attention in school, so yeah, a bit of an improvement. Also, while I was in high school, I was trying to learn more about what hell actually was and what it took to go there, and I was assured by one teacher that so long as I was a good person and didn't, intentionally blaspheme against God, then I would still go to heaven and wouldn't burn in hell. So that at least mitigated my fears of hell somewhat, since I considered myself to be mostly a good person at the time, and unlike pretty much every single other Christian classmate, I never used the words God or Jesus except in reverence. Some Christians they were. However, the advice about hell from one of my religious teachers was actually contradicted by a different teacher that told me that I needed both faith and good works to preserve myself from hell. Because, it wouldn't be Christianity without the contradicting messages. In regards to masturbation, thank Glob for the internet, since I had a mobile device that pretty much had all the information I needed at my fingertips, and was able to do research and find out that jerking off is actually a completely normal and harmless action. So that kind of contributed to less stress for me. From that point on, for my first 2 years of high school, it really was a gradual process of me just sloping down the hill towards agnosticism, but with a newer and more developed teenage brain, I was really starting to pay attention to some of the actual teachings of the Catholic Church that I was learning about, and many of them just didn't really sit right with me. In fact, not only were some of the things I was being taught not quite making sense, but I actually found myself kind of disagreeing with some of the things I was being taught. What? Forming an actual opinion of my own contrary to my religious beliefs? The scandal! That's not supposed to happen. Because as we all know, there has never been a single person whose personal beliefs have completely contradicted what the religion they follow teaches, right? But yeah, I didn't really agree with what I was being taught about things like gay marriage or divorce, and of course I didn't really express these criticisms very much in class, but I really was just starting to question more and more if what I was actually being taught was true or just a load of BS. By the summer before junior year, however, I had officially become an agnostic, and I wasn't really sure whether or not God existed. However, I had pretty much gotten over the anxiety that my lack of faith used to cause me, as I had already reconciled with myself that if God did not exist, then I was honestly completely content with the fact that my consciousness would be extinguished in death, as the impermanence of human life as a concept had never really bothered me before. And if God did exist, then if he was a truly just God, as I had been told he was, then he would not be willing to let me burn in hell forever just for having perfectly legitimate reasons for doubting him. However, when I tried to express my general lack of faith to other people, and that I was content with the agnostic position that I had come to, one thing that I pretty much always heard in response was, "Don't give up on God, Michael, because you will find God if you really try. Don't make the mistake of writing off his existence too soon. You will live a much happier life with more blessings believing in him." And to be honest, I thought that was a completely sound argument. I mean, yeah, I thought to myself, maybe I really am jumping the gun on this. I mean, I'm only 16. How could I possibly say that I have an adequate level of knowledge about this topic? I've been leaning more and more towards atheism every day, but if there really is something to this whole God thing, then I shouldn't just abandon it. I should be trying to learn and experience as much as I can to make an informed decision. So I did just that, and I was not simply content to let myself drift away from my faith, but instead I would really put it under a microscope. In my theology course for junior year, I really paid a lot of attention in class. I carefully answered every short answer question, read my entire theology textbook and supplemental materials, and I would often raise my hand and ask questions in class if anything didn't make sense to me, thus forever cementing my reputation in school as that weird kid in class with no friends who asks way too many questions and always runs everywhere instead of walking. A reputation I was more than proud to bear. Throughout the school year, I certainly came into my theology class with a more skeptical disposition, and I sometimes engaged in some heated but respectful debates with my teacher. It was at this time that I also started doing some studies on other religions and what their beliefs were. I also began going with my dad to his church in addition to just my mom's church, and doing so definitely opened my eyes, because before going to my dad's church, I pretty much just thought that all the different sects of Christianity were essentially the same. But there were a lot of things that I learned about my father's congregation that differed significantly from what I was taught in Catholic school. Some things made more sense to me about the doctrine there, like how people in that church got baptized by their own free choice, rather than as completely non-consenting infants, and some things made less sense, like how it apparently didn't matter what your actions in life were, because whether life-saving doctor or murderer, you really only needed to believe in Jesus Christ to be saved. Another thing that was different about my dad's church was that I was actually capable of paying attention to what the pastor was saying. Seriously, I cannot emphasize enough how slow, monotone, and boring Catholic church speakers are in masses. But getting back to the actual point, though, in regards to my dad's church, there was one particular moment that was a distinctly crucial point in my journey to atheism. You see, when I went with my dad to his church during Christmas, after Mass, I was asked by the pastor if I wanted to join a prayer group. And seeing as how I didn't really have much of a firm belief in God anymore, and also the fact that I was going to 2 different churches and had tons of homework amongst other things that I had to do for school, I politely declined the offer. However, before I left, the pastor decided to give me a gift. He gave me this copy of the King James Version of the Holy Bible, and asked me to read it. Now, the idea of reading the Bible had certainly popped in my head before this moment, and I had planned to get starting reading it sometime in the future. You see, though I certainly had been taught about the Bible by Catholic authority figures, I had never actually sat down and read it before. I really only just read specific chapters that were suggested to me by teachers or priests. And I think that is the case for a lot of Christians, if not most, but that never really seemed right to me. I mean, this is the most important book in the world, meant to offer you lifelong wisdom and teach you everything you need to know about your faith. So why the hell do Christians read only 10% of it? I mean, before I was given the book at Christmas, I didn't really think I would be starting my endeavor of reading the Bible so soon. I mean, for real, have you ever held the Bible? It's freaking huge. I mean, how the heck was I supposed to get through it all? As you can probably tell from the worn-down look of it, though, I used this Bible quite extensively. All of a sudden, at that moment when I was handed the Bible by that pastor as a Christmas gift, I just said to myself, screw it, I'm going to start reading it, and I'm going to start right now. So I did, and it totally didn't conflict with my incredibly inflated, incredibly stressful school schedule at all. By that point in my life, though, I had certainly become a much more disciplined reader and was much better able to concentrate for extended periods of time. But I still didn't have that much free time to spare during my junior year in high school. But I was still able to set aside a few hours here and there to read the Bible. And I was eventually able to get through reading the first book of Genesis all the way through. Now, to be honest, I don't really know what I was expecting when I was going into reading the Bible, but I guess, I didn't really expect there to be any glaring proof that would convince me that God was definitely real, that I would find in reading it, but I did still expect that I would still learn a lot, and, the Bible was supposedly filled with some really intelligent words of wisdom. At least that's what everyone kept telling me. I mean, seriously, I heard all the time from people, the Bible is such a great book, it's the greatest book of all time. Even if it might not be all literal, it still has such great and powerful messages in it. And you know what, I sort of bought into that in the time, and I thought, that must be the reason why Christianity is so widespread. It just has a really wise holy book that was so ahead of its time, even if it's not actually real. But I also just thought to myself, hey, this is the Holy Bible we're talking about, the supposed ultimate source of knowledge and truth that all Christians base their belief on. If this book doesn't at least get me thinking that there might be the tiniest sliver of some truth and divinity to this whole religion, then nothing will. However, as the old saying goes, the Bible truly is the most effective tool for turning a former Christian into an atheist. and make an atheist out of me it did.